This is Dr. Kathy Millhauser with a lecture on cultural awareness. This lecture will focus on a model for intercultural sensitivity developed by Milton Bennett. The model is called the Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what culture is and some of the more common dimensions of culture that we see. Culture is basically a set of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs that a group has developed and sustained over time. There is a separate lecture on my website and YouTube channel that goes into depth on what culture is based on Edgar Schein's work. For the purposes of this lecture, we will focus on differences in national or ethnic culture. Since culture is made up of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs, culture can exist in a variety of settings. A society of people can have a culture, organizations can have a culture, groups within an organization can have a culture. People inside an organization who are at the same stage of their careers might also have a culture. Culture is simply a word we use to describe the shared values and assumptions of a group. So the model we will be reviewing can be applied to differences between any type of group, but since the differences in national culture are often problematic in organizations, we will use national culture to illustrate this lecture. This illustration includes 6 stages in Bennett's model. The basic idea is that each of us, as human beings, start at the far left of this model, and then grow and evolve throughout our lifetimes as we become more sensitive to differences. Thus, the first 3 stages are what is referred to as ethnocentric stages. This means that at this point in a person's development, everything they believe about other people and other cultures is based on what they believe about themselves. Thus, the word centric is used. People in these stages experience their own culture as central to all reality. The second group of stages are ethno-relative, meaning that at this point in a person's development, they begin to see other people and their differences as relative to how they see themselves. Thus, the word relative is used. At these later stages, a person can view differences in culture as they relate to the person's own culture without judging others as wrong based on an ethnocentric perspective. People in these stages understand that behavior can only be understood within a cultural context. Keep in mind throughout this lecture that none of these stages are inherently right or wrong. They are developmental. So a person will develop their sensitivity to differences in culture as they grow, and not everyone will reach stage 6. As a matter of fact, you will see when we get into the examples that people who evolve to the final stage are very rare. We will begin by discussing the ethnocentric stages. Bennett refers to the first stage as denial. A person in denial about cultural differences basically doesn't believe that there are really any differences between cultures. They think everyone is the same, or should be. Someone different might be seen as an anomaly to a person at this stage of development. Think of a child. As a child is first beginning to relate to others, he relates as if everyone else is the same as him. He tries to feed his bottle to his father and mother, assuming that if he likes the bottle, so will they. The child sees everything through the lens of himself and expects everyone to feel and respond like he does. In cultural sensitivity terms, we would call this a denial that there are differences. In terms of how this plays out in organizations, you might hear some of the phrases on this slide when talking with a person in denial about differences in culture. The second stage is called defense. In this stage, the person understands that there are differences in culture and they don't like those differences. This person might be frightened by people who are different than her. She might not be in denial about differences, but is also not comfortable with them. She sees any difference in culture as a threat to her own beliefs, values, and assumptions. Keep in mind that this is a natural stage in the development of a culturally sensitive person. If we all start in denial as children and all hope to evolve to culturally sensitive and appreciative adults, we all have to work through a process of defense before we come to accept and embrace people who are different than us. As you think about the examples of how people might behave when they are at this stage, keep in mind that this stage is based on fear and is part of a natural process. Do some people get stuck here? Yes, we all know that there are some adults who live in fear and defense, often aggressively, of people who are different than themselves. But hopefully these people are a minority, and perhaps if you know people stuck here in your organization, learning more about cultural awareness will help you to understand and eventually help them to grow. The next stage and the final stage in the ethnocentric set is labeled minimization. In this stage, the person has accepted that there are differences, but basically thinks that the differences are no big deal. The Disneyland song, "It's a Small World After All," comes to mind. People at this stage believe that if they get to know people from different cultures and just treat them like people, then everything will be fine. They may do really well with forming superficial relationships with people from different cultures, but will have trouble truly understanding individuals who are different from themselves. Differences are trivialized and similarities overgeneralized at this stage. Next are the ethno-relative stages, which mark a change in perspective on the part of the individual who is learning to be more culturally sensitive. The first of the ethno-relative stages is labeled acceptance. At this point in a person's development, he has finally come to accept that there are cultural differences between himself and others, and that these differences are not only okay, but can be positive. This person is beginning to realize that diversity can lead to more creativity in a team, for example. A person at this stage might be really excited to learn about a new culture and experiment with different foods, ways to dress, and even customs. At this point, differences are noted and are respected, but differences might still be only appreciated at a surface level. In these images, many people are posing in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa for pictures. They show enthusiasm for the culture that they are participating in, but not really a deep adaptation yet at this point. The next stage is called adaptation. At this stage, a more proactive approach to cultural change is adopted. People who reach this stage of intercultural sensitivity are ready to immerse themselves in a new culture, understand how others have developed their values, beliefs, and assumptions, and begin to adapt so that they can truly relate to the other group. This person is a highly evolved individual who can stay grounded in his or her own culture while still interacting deeply with others. They are skilled facilitators who can bring different groups together, solving disputes and resolving conflicts. Interestingly, people who have developed to this fifth stage often say that once they began to truly understand the culture, they got better at the language. The artifacts of the culture start to make sense at this stage, as the values and assumptions of the culture become evident. It is worth noting that this is the stage that most of us can aspire to in our lives. If we keep an open mind and expose ourselves to many people who are different from us, we can become adaptable to new cultures and new ways of thinking. We don't all have to aspire to the sixth stage, which, as I said in the beginning of the lecture, is not attainable for most of us. This final stage in Bennett's model is called integration. At this stage of development, a person not only accepts and adapts to new cultures easily, they have actually let go of any home culture and have become a member of all cultures. This is not a common accomplishment, and is generally only achieved by people who lived in many diverse cultures and circumstances throughout their lives, and beginning when they were children. Most of us feel grounded in our home culture, but this person feels mobile and is able to integrate into any culture that he or she is placed into. Some would argue that this model comes full circle at this point, and that the sixth stage is similar to the first stage, denial. Isn't a person who believes that they can integrate into any culture basically the same as one who believes that there are no differences? Actually, no, they are not the same. There is a fundamental difference. The person who has evolved to stage 6, integration, does not deny that there are differences. They are simply able to identify with multiple cultures. They have adopted a personal identity of diversity, inclusion, and integration, which is very different from a person who believes that we are all the same. Finally, here again is the slide with the 6 stages in Bennett's model, with the first 3 labeled as ethnocentric and the final 3 as ethno-relative. Keep in mind that not everyone will move through this model at the same rate. Not everyone will reach stage 6 or even stage 5 in their lifetime, and that the ability to grow and develop into a culturally sensitive person is influenced by how much diversity a person is exposed to and how they learn to cope with and eventually revel in those differences. This concludes my lecture on cultural differences. I hope that you have found value in Bennett's model. Give some thought to where you are on the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity and what you can do to become more culturally aware. Thank you for your attention.